The autumn sun filtered through the yellowed curtains of his modest living room, casting elongated shadows across the worn hardwood floors. It was a Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of day where the weather couldn't quite decide whether to embrace fall or cling to summer's warmth. Moved slowly through her kitchen, preparing breakfast with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned never to rush around a traumatized child. Her weathered hands, hands that had raised 3 children of her own and now carried the weight of her grandson's emotional burden, arranged scrambled eggs and toast on a small ceramic plate decorated with cartoon characters. 3-year-old sat at the kitchen table, his small frame hunched over, his eyes fixed on something invisible to everyone else in the world. His curly dark hair fell across his forehead, partially obscuring the vacant expression that had become permanent over the past 6 months. He didn't look at the plate set before him. He didn't acknowledge her presence, though she bent down and kissed the top of his head, whispering words of encouragement that fell into an abyss of silence. "Sweetie, eat your breakfast," said softly, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who'd learned that harsh tones could trigger anxiety spirals. "You need your strength, baby." Small fingers picked up a piece of toast, brought it to his mouth, and mechanically chewed. There was no joy in the action, no natural childhood enthusiasm. Every movement seemed to require intense concentration, as though his mind was struggling to send signals to his body. Watched from the counter, her heart breaking silently for the 100th time that week. The kitchen was dated but meticulously clean. Photographs lined the walls, pictures of 3 adult children, their families, and scattered among them, images of his mother, Jennifer, from happier times. There was one photograph that always looked at with complicated emotions, a picture of Jennifer holding newborn, her face radiant with maternal joy. That Jennifer seemed like a stranger now, a ghost from a different lifetime. The real Jennifer was fighting for her life in a rehabilitation facility downtown, struggling to overcome an opioid addiction that had nearly cost her everything, including custody of her son. Was 68 years old, an age when most women were planning retirement, traveling, spoiling on weekends, and then returning them to their parents. Instead, she'd become full-time guardian. Social services had placed him in her care 8 months ago, after Jennifer's overdose and subsequent arrest for drug possession. The paperwork had been swift but heartbreaking. The judge had been compassionate but firm. Until Jennifer completed rehabilitation and demonstrated sustained sobriety, would remain with his grandmother. The first weeks had been chaotic, had arrived at its doorstep with a small suitcase of belongings and a heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. He'd watched his mother collapse. He'd heard the sirens. He'd experienced the terrifying separation, the confusion, the instability. Children don't process trauma like adults do. They internalize it, and their developing minds create protective barriers that can seal them off from the world entirely. Within 3 months of arriving at his home, had stopped speaking. Not gradually, but suddenly, as though someone had flipped a switch in his brain. One day he'd said, "Grandma, I'm hungry." The next day, silence. Complete, absolute silence that no amount of love, encouragement, or coaxing could penetrate. Had taken him to doctor, a child psychologist recommended by his school. The diagnosis had been delivered with clinical precision: selective mutism, a psychological condition where children understand language and are capable of speech but cannot produce it in certain situations, typically due to extreme anxiety or trauma. Doctor had explained that silence wasn't stubbornness or defiance. It was his mind's way of protecting him from a world that had proven catastrophically unsafe. The young boy had learned that bad things happened, and somewhere in the architecture of his developing brain, he'd concluded that staying silent meant staying invisible, and staying invisible meant staying safe. It's not uncommon in children who experience significant trauma, Doctor had explained, her voice professional but not unkind. With time, patience, and possibly therapy, many children recover their voice, but there's no timeline. Recovery is individual. Individual, that word haunted. She had no template for this. She didn't know how to reach a child who'd locked himself away in his own mind. She'd read articles, attended support groups for grandparents raising traumatized children, and tried every suggestion professionals offered. She used visual communication cards with pictures. She played soft music. She created a safe space in her home, a corner with cushions and soft blankets where could retreat when overwhelmed. She did everything right, and still he remained silent. The isolation of it was profound. Would sit beside, reading stories aloud, hoping her voice might penetrate the walls he'd constructed. She'd watch other children his age playing at the park, their voices bright and carefree, while sat beside her, watching the world with ancient, sad eyes that seemed too knowing for a 3-year-old. Her daughter had suggested that maybe needed professional help beyond what doctor offered. "Mom, you're doing amazing, but maybe this needs medication. Intensive therapy." Meant well, but her words carried an undercurrent of doubt that wounded. Doubt in her ability to heal her grandson, doubt in the power of love alone, doubt that a 68-year-old grandmother could be enough. On this particular Tuesday morning, as silently ate his breakfast and moved through the familiar rituals of care, wiping his mouth, changing his clothes, preparing for another day, she felt the weight of exhaustion settling deeper into her bones. She'd been running on fumes for months, surviving on hope and determination, but some days the silence felt deafening, suffocating, absolute. She decided to let him play outside in the sandbox after breakfast. The weatherman had predicted clear skies, and fresh air was always better than the stale indoor atmosphere. Spread a blanket on the back porch and sat down with her mending, keeping one eye always on as he climbed into the sandbox with his plastic shovel and bucket. He began the repetitive motion of scooping and pouring, a mindless, meditative activity that seemed to calm him slightly. Didn't know that this would be the day everything changed. She didn't know that fate, in the form of a police cruiser and a German shepherd, was about to turn their world upside down. She simply sat in the autumn sun, mending a tear-rinsed jacket, and held onto the fragile hope that someday, somehow, her grandson would find his way back to them. The gentle rustling of leaves, the distant sound of neighborhood traffic, and the whisper of wind through the trees formed the backdrop of this quiet Tuesday morning. It was an ordinary day, unremarkable in every way, until it wasn't. The police cruiser turned onto Avenue at approximately 2:47 in the afternoon. Officer Thomas sat in the driver's seat, his dark eyes focused on the street ahead while his partner, Duke, occupied the reinforced K9 compartment in the back of the vehicle. Duke was a 5-year-old German shepherd with a remarkable service record, 14 successful drug busts, 7 criminal apprehensions, and countless community appearances where he'd won the hearts of and their families alike. The dog possessed an intelligence that transcended typical canine capability. He seemed to understand not just commands, but intent, emotion, and the subtle language of human suffering. Officer had received the dispatch call 15 minutes earlier. A noise complaint on Avenue, possible domestic dispute, but the preliminary report was vague. These kinds of calls were often nothing. Neighbors arguing about music volume, teenagers throwing a party while parents were away. But they always required investigation. Had been working the K9 unit for 8 years, and Duke had become more than a partner. He was a friend, a confidant, the living embodiment of loyalty and purpose. "All right, buddy," said as he pulled up to the curb 2 houses down from the address in question. "Looks like a quiet day. Hopefully this is nothing serious." Duke's ears perked up at the sound of his voice. The dog understood the routine. He knew that sometimes they'd exit together for an active call, and sometimes they'd wait in the vehicle while handled matters alone. Today's situation didn't appear to require a K9 presence, so decided he'd investigate first, then determine if Duke was needed. He stepped out of the cruiser, left the engine running for air circulation, and cracked the rear windows to ensure adequate ventilation. The back door locks were secured, a standard protocol that had never failed him in 8 years, was meticulous about safety and procedure. He'd served in the military before becoming a police officer, and that discipline permeated every aspect of his professional life. As walked toward the house in question, he noticed the afternoon was remarkably pleasant. The temperature had settled into that perfect zone where it felt comfortable without being oppressive. A few neighbors were outside, someone washing their car 2 houses down, an elderly woman tending to her garden. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing seemed to happen, where life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. The noise complaint turned out to be nothing serious. A teenager had been playing music too loudly while his parents were at work. When officers showed up, the young man immediately turned it down, apologetic and polite. The confrontation lasted approximately 8 minutes. Knew instinctively this wasn't a situation requiring police intervention, just a friendly reminder of noise ordinances and community consideration. He was walking back to his cruiser, already mentally clearing this call from his active list, when something unexpected happened. A sudden gust of wind, one of those random weather phenomena that comes without warning, swept through the neighborhood with surprising force. The kind of wind that rattles trees, sends leaves spiraling, and, unfortunately, can catch doors and windows that aren't firmly secured. The rear window of his cruiser, which he'd cracked open for Duke's ventilation, had swung slightly wider in that gust. The door lock, designed for security during transport, had one weakness. It wasn't meant to withstand a determined push from 85 pounds of athletic muscle. Duke felt the change in air pressure immediately. His intelligence had been both his greatest asset and occasional liability. He understood opportunity. He understood that the window had opened wider. And in that moment, something primal awakened in the dog, not aggression, but curiosity mixed with a dog's natural desire to investigate. He'd spent his career following commands, sitting in vehicles, waiting patiently. But dogs, even highly trained ones, remain dogs. And this dog had caught a scent on the wind that intrigued him. With a powerful thrust of his body against the partially open door, Duke pushed through the opening. The security latch held momentarily, then gave way. Suddenly, 85 pounds of German Shepherd exploded onto Avenue, his powerful legs carrying him forward with the joyful momentum of a dog freed from confinement. Officer heard the commotion and spun around, his heart stopping for a fraction of a second. Duke, come," he commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. But Duke had already caught that scent, a different scent, one that wasn't food or threat or command related. It was fear. It was sadness. It was the distinctive chemical signature of a deeply traumatized child. Duke's trajectory took him directly towards house, toward the sandbox where sat with his plastic shovel, unaware of the approaching animal. Heard the frantic barking before she saw anything. Her head snapped up from her mending, her maternal instincts firing instantly. A large dog was loose on her street, heading toward her property. Her eyes widened with primal terror as she watched a massive German Shepherd bound toward the sandbox where sat vulnerably, completely alone, completely exposed. She screamed, her voice cutting through the afternoon air like a knife. She dropped her mending and lurched forward, her 68-year-old body moving faster than it had in years, propelled by the ancient, unstoppable force of protection. But Officer was also moving. He sprinted toward his dog, shouting commands, his professional training warring with his personal panic. Duke had never attacked anything without command, but these situations were unpredictable. Anything could happen. However, remained motionless. The 3-year-old turned toward the approaching dog with an expression that was difficult to categorize. There was fear in his eyes, a reflexive recognition of danger. But there was something else too, something that transcended logic, a strange kind of resignation, as though his broken little heart was simply accepting whatever came next as part of the catastrophe that was his life. Duke reached the sandbox at full speed, was still 10 feet away, Officer was shouting, and the world seemed to slow into a crystalline moment of terrible possibility. The massive German Shepherd approached the small child at a full run, his paws kicking up sand, his body tense with energy and purpose. And then something miraculous happened. Duke didn't jump. He didn't bark. Instead, with a sudden, graceful motion that seemed almost choreographed, the powerful dog decelerated to a gentle trot. In the final 3 feet before reaching, Duke's entire demeanor transformed. His ears lowered slightly in a gesture of submission and gentleness. His tail, which had been rigid, began to wag with a soft, measured rhythm. When Duke reached, he didn't bowl over the child or overwhelm him with excited energy. Instead, the dog performed what could only be described as an act of profound compassion. Duke carefully lowered his massive head until it rested directly on its lap. The 85-pound German Shepherd, trained for aggression and protection, transformed himself into something entirely different, a devoted guardian offering comfort to a broken soul. Froze mid-stride, her terrified gasp catching in her throat. Officer skidded to a halt, his training suddenly immaterial in the face of what he was witnessing. The moment stretched out, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, an eternity compressed into ordinary time. Then moved his small hand and placed it on Duke's head. His tiny fingers buried themselves in the dog's thick fur. His lips moved, barely perceptibly. "Big dog," came the whisper. The first 2 words had spoken in 6 months, delivered so softly it was almost a prayer. His legs literally gave out. She sat down hard in the dirt, tears immediately flooding her face. Officer stood frozen, witnessing something he couldn't quite explain, something that transcended the rational world of police work and training protocols. It was pure connection, pure healing, pure magic emerging from absolute darkness. Duke remained perfectly still, his head resting on his lap, his breathing steady and calm, as though he understood exactly what this moment meant, and was committed to honoring it with his complete presence. Officer Thomas didn't sleep that night. He lay in his modest apartment on the north side of Columbus, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The way Duke had lowered his head, the way small hand had trembled as it touched the dog's fur. Those 2 whispered words, "Big dog." It was etched into his memory with the permanence of a photograph, every detail crystal clear and impossible to ignore. At 36 years old, Thomas had built a reputation as a dedicated by-the-book officer. He'd served 13 years in the military as a canine handler before joining the Columbus Police Department 8 years ago. He'd seen combat. He'd experienced loss. He understood trauma and the ways it could reshape a person's internal landscape. But he'd never witnessed healing happen so instantaneously, so completely, so impossibly. By 4 a.m., gave up on sleep and moved to his laptop. He began researching therapy dogs, programs that utilized animals in therapeutic settings, studies on animal-assisted intervention for traumatized children. The more he read, the more his conviction. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was something real, something scientific, something that worked. He found studies from universities showing measurable improvements in anxiety levels, cortisol reduction, increased social interaction, and emotional regulation in children who participated in structured animal therapy. He discovered programs in California, Texas, and New York where police K-9s worked dual roles, law enforcement and therapy support. He read testimonials from parents and children describing transformation that mirrored exactly what he'd witnessed within. By the time dawn broke over Columbus, Officer had filled 3 digital notebooks with research, websites, contact information, and program frameworks. He'd also made a decision. This wouldn't be a passing interest or casual hobby. He was going to make this his mission. The first challenge came at roll call the following morning. Supervisor Captain called him aside after briefing. "I heard about the incident on Avenue. Duke escaping like that's a first for you. You doing okay?" "Actually, Captain, that's what I wanted to talk about," said carefully. "Something happened during that call, something that made me think differently about Duke's potential." Raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Explained the situation, how Duke had approached, how the traumatized child had spoken for the first time in months, how the connection seemed to transcend normal dog-handler dynamics. Listened politely but with visible skepticism. That's an interesting story, but you know that Duke is a working K9. We can't have him distracted by therapy gigs while we need him for active police work. I'm not suggesting that, sir, replied, his mind already strategizing. I'm suggesting Duke could serve dual purposes. Police work remains the priority, but perhaps structured, supervised sessions with traumatized children could occur during off hours, with proper protocols and oversight. Crossed his arms. That's not how we operate. Our K9s are tools for law enforcement. They're not emotional support animals. That's a different world entirely. With respect, sir, I think it could be both, said, his determination evident. I'm asking for permission to explore this further, in my own time, on my own initiative. Sighed, do what you want on your personal time, but this department isn't allocating resources to turn police dogs into therapy animals. That's not our mission. That conversation became the first of many obstacles, but had expected resistance. He'd learned in the military and in law enforcement that change came slowly, that institutions moved like battleships, requiring enormous effort to change direction. He wasn't discouraged. He was motivated. Over the following 3 weeks, attended every training seminar he could find related to therapy dogs. He drove to Cincinnati for a weekend conference on animal-assisted therapy. He contacted universities with canine psychology programs. He read books by Dr. the pioneer who discovered that dogs could facilitate therapeutic breakthroughs with emotionally withdrawn children. He learned about oxytocin release, the neurochemical bonding that occurred between humans and animals, the measurable physiological benefits of human-animal interaction. His colleagues began noticing the change. During lunch breaks, instead of discussing police work or sports, was reading academic papers on traumatized children and attachment theory. His apartment became a library of research materials, books stacked on every available surface, dog-eared pages filled with his own handwritten notes and highlighted passages. "You're obsessed, man," his fellow officer Martinez said one afternoon, watching review yet another research document. "This therapy dog thing consuming you." "It's not a thing," corrected. "It's an opportunity. We're sitting on something incredible and we don't even realize it." The turning point came when discovered Doctor's research. She was a renowned child psychologist at Ohio State University who specialized in trauma recovery in foster children. Her work on selective mutism had been published in prestigious journals. More importantly, she'd been advocating for animal-assisted therapy as a legitimate clinical intervention for exactly the kinds of children wanted to help. Found her email address on the university website and crafted a careful, professional message. He included the research he'd gathered, his observations about Duke, and a humble request for consultation. He didn't expect an immediate response, but Doctor replied within 24 hours, expressing genuine interest and requesting a meeting. The conference room at Ohio State felt intimidating. Doctor was younger than expected, perhaps 50, with sharp intelligence evident in her dark eyes. She reviewed his materials carefully, asking detailed questions about Duke's training, his background, and the specific moment of connection. "This is remarkable," she said finally, setting down the documents. "What you're describing isn't anecdotal. It's measurable, repeatable, and clinically significant. I've been advocating for programs like this for 5 years, and most police departments dismiss it as frivolous. But the science supports what you witnessed." "So you think it could work?" asked, hope rising in his chest. "I know it can work," Doctor replied. "The question is whether you're willing to fight for it. Your department won't approve this easily. There are liability concerns, budget constraints, and institutional resistance. But if you're serious, if you're truly committed, I'll help you build a framework that's scientifically sound and administratively defensible." Over the next month, and Doctor worked together, developing protocols, creating training guidelines, and building a proposal that addressed every possible administrative objection. They documented case studies, compiled statistics, and created a comprehensive pilot program framework. Doctor drafted letters of support from colleagues at the university. They built a case so thorough, so scientifically rigorous, that it would be difficult to dismiss without serious justification. But understood something else too. Research and documentation were important, but they weren't enough. What was needed was proof. A child who'd been changed. A success story that couldn't be argued away with statistics or liability concerns. That child was called the day after his second meeting with Dr. Ms. This is Officer. I've been thinking about and I have a proposal for you. I believe Duke might be able to help him further in a structured, professional way. Would you be willing to work with us? His voice on the phone was tentative but hopeful. You mean more visits with Duke? More than that, explained. I want to establish a formal therapy program with professional oversight, specific protocols, and documented progress. I want to help your grandson find his voice completely, but I'll need your partnership to make it happen. There was silence on the other end, then's voice, thick with emotion. Officer, you can have anything you need from me. Anything. If there's a chance to help, we'll do whatever it takes. That conversation crystallized everything. The research, the meetings with Doctor, the careful documentation, all of it suddenly had a purpose beyond theory, was real. His suffering was real, and the possibility of healing him was real too. Thomas had found his true calling. The first official therapy session was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in late September. Had cleaned her house meticulously, as though Officer and Duke were visiting royalty rather than a police officer and his K-9 partner. She'd vacuumed the living room carpet 3 times, arranged fresh flowers in a vase on the coffee table, and baked chocolate chip cookies that now cooled on the kitchen counter. It was nervousness manifesting as domestic preparation, the age-old ritual of trying to control variables when so much felt uncertain. Sensed something was different. He sat by the window, his small face pressed against the glass, watching the street with more alertness than he'd shown in months. Wondered if he somehow remembered, if his traumatized mind had retained the memory of the dog, the connection, the miraculous moment of speaking. When Officer's cruiser pulled up at 2:15 p.m., made a small sound, barely audible but unmistakable to his trained ear. It was a whimper of recognition, or perhaps anticipation. She moved to stand beside him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "Duke's here, sweetheart," she whispered. "Remember Duke." Didn't respond verbally, but his body went rigid with anticipation. His small fingers pressed harder against the window glass. Officer emerged from the vehicle with Duke on a leash, standard protocol that differed from their first chaotic encounter. This time, everything was controlled, professional, intentional. Doctor had arrived separately and waited on the porch with a leather portfolio containing assessment forms, observation sheets, and documentation protocols. This wasn't casual or spontaneous. It was structured therapeutic intervention with scientific rigor. "Open the door before could knock. Please come in, has been watching for you." As they entered, Duke immediately oriented toward but remained calmly at side, waiting for direction. It was a striking contrast to the wild, joyful energy of their first encounter. This version of Duke was professional, controlled, but no less connected to the boy. Officer said gently, kneeling to the boy's level, "This is Doctor. She's going to help us understand how Duke can be your special friend. Is that okay?" Didn't respond verbally, but he took a small step toward Duke, his eyes fixed on the dog's face with singular intensity. "Let's sit in the living room," Doctor suggested, her clinical tone softened by genuine warmth. "Officer, why don't you start with some basic interaction while I observe?" What followed was a carefully orchestrated session combining spontaneity with structure, allowed Duke to approach at the dog's own pace. They didn't force physical contact or demand performance. Instead, they created space for natural connection to emerge. Duke settled onto the floor beside, close enough to touch but not intrusive. Small hand eventually reached out, tentatively making contact with Duke's fur. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Over the course of that first 30-minute session, his body language changed. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing deepened. The tension that seemed permanently etched into his 3-year-old frame began to dissolve. He made small vocalizations, not quite words, but sounds of comfort and contentment that hadn't heard since he'd arrived at her home. As they prepared to leave, Officer turned to with a smile. "Same time next Thursday." Nodded eagerly, though her eyes remained fixed on, who watched Duke depart with visible reluctance. That night ate his dinner, not mechanically but with actual interest. He pointed at his empty plate and realized he was asking for seconds. A small thing, perhaps, but monumental in the context of withdrawal. The second session occurred the following Thursday. This time, waited by the door 5 minutes before the scheduled arrival time, demonstrating anticipation and memory integration that Doctor noted carefully on her observation sheet. The sessions became a structured ritual, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2:15 p.m., 30 minutes of guided interaction between and Duke, with Doctor observing and documenting everything. By week 3, began attempting to vocalize more consistently. He made sounds that weren't quite words but suggested emerging language patterns. Doctor showed a chart she'd created tracking communication attempts across sessions. The graph showed a clear upward trajectory. "He's not just mechanically improving," Doctor explained during one of their progress check-ins. "He's showing signs of genuine emotional engagement. The dog is facilitating what we call safe attachment. Is learning that connection can be safe, that trust can be rebuilt." Week 4 brought the first major breakthrough. During the Thursday session, looked directly at Officer and attempted to form a word. His mouth worked, his body tensed with effort, and then, "Duke." It was broken and halting, but unmistakably intentional speech directed at a human. Burst into tears. Doctor's clinical composure cracked slightly, and even Officer's eyes glistened with emotion. They maintained professionalism, not wanting to overwhelm with dramatic reactions, but the significance of the moment couldn't be overstated. 6 months of silence had been penetrated. The wall was beginning to crack. Over the following weeks, his vocabulary expanded incrementally. Dog, big, soft, Duke. Simple words, but each one represented a bridge rebuilt between his traumatized mind and the external world. More significantly, his overall anxiety decreased. Noticed he was sleeping better, eating with genuine appetite rather than mechanical compliance, and showing interest in activities beyond passive observation. At school, his preschool teachers reported changes, was beginning to participate in group activities, though still quietly. He drew pictures, crude crayon renderings of a large brown dog that were unmistakably Duke. During circle time, he didn't speak, but he sat closer to other children, suggesting a reduction in social anxiety. By week 8, Doctor presented her formal assessment to Officer, and the documentation was thorough. Anxiety scores down 70%, verbal attempts increased 300%, engagement with external environment significantly improved, sleep quality normalized, eating patterns restored to age-appropriate levels. "What we're seeing," Doctor explained, "is genuine therapeutic progress. The human-animal bond is facilitating neural integration. His brain is literally healing through his connection with Duke." Officer approached his captain with the documentation. "Sir, I'd like to request official approval to expand this program. Is one child, but there are hundreds like him in the foster care system. The results are undeniable." Captain reviewed the materials, and for the first time, saw hesitation in his supervisor's expression. Not skepticism, but genuine consideration. "This is substantial," admitted, "but it's also outside normal operations. I'll need to take this to administration." 2 weeks later was called to a meeting with the department's administration. They reviewed doctor's research, discussed liability protocols, and examined the documented results. The discussion was rigorous, the questioning pointed, but ultimately a decision was reached. "We're approving a 6-month pilot program," the chief administrator announced. "But it operates under strict parameters, structured sessions only, professional therapeutic oversight, documented protocols, and quarterly progress reviews. Officer, you'll coordinate this program. Doctor, we'll need your continued clinical involvement. And one more thing, you get 2 additional cases maximum during this pilot phase." Hugged that evening, her arms surrounding her grandson who transformed from a silent, traumatized child into someone actively engaged with life. He wrapped his small arms around her neck and whispered, "Love, Duke." She held him closer, tears streaming down her face, knowing that the impossible had become possible, that love, expressed through an unexpected partnership between a grandmother, a police officer, a psychologist, and a remarkable dog, had rewritten her grandson's story. The journey was far from over, but the direction was clear, toward healing, toward hope, toward transformation. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, 9 months into the therapy dog pilot program. Officer was reviewing session notes at his desk when Captain appeared, his face carrying the grim expression of someone bearing unwelcome news. "My office now." Inside the captain's office, closed the door carefully, a deliberate gesture that immediately elevated anxiety. Something significant was happening. "The city council met last night," began, settling into his chair with visible reluctance. "We're facing a 15% budget reduction across all city departments, police included. The mayor's office is looking at ways to cut costs, and non-essential programs are being eliminated." Felt his stomach tighten. "The therapy dog program." "Among other things," confirmed. "I fought for it. I presented the documentation, the results, doctor's research. But the bean counters don't care about therapeutic outcomes. They see it as a luxury, not a necessity. The program is being defunded effective end of March. That gives you 6 weeks to wrap things up." The words felt surreal, as though was hearing them from underwater. 6 weeks. That was all they had. 6 weeks to dismantle something that had taken months to build, something that was actively changing lives. "Sir, with respect, those results are quantifiable. We have documentation showing." "I know," interrupted not unkindly, "but budget crises don't care about sentiment. I'm sorry." Walked back to his desk in a daze. He immediately called Doctor, who answered on the second ring. "It's Thomas. The program is being cut, end of March." There was a long silence on the other end. "Are you certain?" "Captain just told me. Budget reduction, non-essential programs." "This is unconscionable," Doctor said, her clinical composure cracking into genuine anger. "We have 3 months of data showing measurable improvement in 5 cases. We're about to publish a peer-reviewed study on the efficacy of this program, and they're cutting it." "That's the reality," said, feeling the weight of defeat settling over him. "I don't know what to do." "Fight," Doctor said flatly. "That's what we do. We document everything, we publicize the results, and we fight this decision. But I need to be honest with you. If they've made this decision at the administrative level, revering it will be difficult." What neither of them anticipated was that circumstances were about to become far more complicated. 3 days later, called officer in a state of panic. "Officer, something's wrong." Caseworker called. "She's being reassigned and a new caseworker is taking over his case. They want to schedule a home visit for Friday," and she sounded cold, not supportive. "Did she say what this was about?" asked, though he had an uneasy feeling. "She mentioned irregularities in placement continuity and something about police involvement in the child's care." "Officer, what does that mean?" Professional instincts kicked into overdrive. "Don't panic. It's probably routine caseworker transition, but send me the caseworker's name and contact information. I want to stay informed." The new caseworker was named Fletcher, and when reviewed her file, he discovered she had a reputation in social services circles as a strict adherent to protocol, sometimes to the point of inflexibility. She believed in following rules, period, with minimal room for exceptions or innovative approaches. The home visit on Friday was tense. Fletcher arrived in a state car with a clipboard and an expression of professional detachment. She observed home, reviewed documentation, and asked pointed questions about its placement, its capability to provide care, and specifically about the police officer's involvement. "It's irregular," Fletcher stated flatly, reviewing notations in his file. "A police officer conducting unsupervised sessions with a foster child. That creates liability issues. I'm going to have to review this arrangement." "The sessions aren't unsupervised," corrected, her voice tight with anxiety. "Doctor is present for every session. She's a child psychologist from Ohio State. The program is officially sanctioned by the police department." "Nevertheless," Fletcher said, making notes, "the situation requires review. I'm recommending that all non-therapeutic interactions with law enforcement cease immediately. This arrangement is too informal, too unconventional." After Fletcher left, called officer, her voice shaking. She said the arrangement needs to be reviewed. She sounded like she was looking for reasons to shut it down. Tried to be reassuring, but he was deeply concerned. What had seemed like a localized budget crisis was suddenly becoming something more complex, a convergence of administrative obstacles, bureaucratic resistance, and a caseworker determined to eliminate what she viewed as an irregular arrangement. Over the following 2 weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Fletcher filed an official report requesting separation of the therapy program from its placement, citing inappropriate police involvement and lack of standard social services protocols. She requested that be evaluated for potential relocation to a facility with more standard care arrangements. Translation: separation from. When called with news of the relocation recommendation, she was crying so hard she could barely speak. She wants to move him. She says my home arrangement is too unconventional, that the therapy dog program violates standard protocols, and that needs to be in an institutional setting with more oversight. She can't just move him, said, though he knew that yes, technically she could. Foster care system caseworkers had significant discretion in placement decisions. She said if we refuse the institutional placement, she'll initiate proceedings to determine whether my home is an appropriate environment. She's saying I'm not qualified to provide care, that I'm too old, that the program is too experimental. Sensing the emotional upheaval in his grandmother regressed dramatically. The progress they'd fought so hard to achieve began unwinding. He stopped speaking entirely, returning to the silence of his early trauma. His sleep deteriorated. His eating patterns became erratic again. The anxiety that had nearly disappeared returned in full force. Officer arranged an emergency meeting with doctor. They sat in her university office surrounded by research papers and treatment protocols, facing the reality that their program was under siege from multiple directions. "This is what happens with innovative approaches," doctor said bitterly. "Bureaucrats fear what they don't understand. Fletcher sees our program as an exception to protocol, and exceptions threaten the system's sense of control. So she's weaponizing her authority to eliminate it." "Can she actually move?" asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Legally, yes. With difficulty, but yes. She'd need to make a case that the current placement is unsuitable, and she's building that case by framing our program as evidence of inadequate care. The institution she wants to move him to is overcrowded, understaffed, and frankly, terrible. But it follows protocol, and that's what she cares about." "So what do we do?" asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Doctor leaned back in her chair, her mind clearly working through possibilities. "We fight, but we do it legally. We document everything: regression, Fletcher's interference, the therapeutic value of the program, her violations of standard procedure. We contact a family law attorney, and we take this to court if necessary." Court felt his chest tighten. "That's the final escalation," Doctor said quietly. "But sometimes that's what justice requires." When informed her of the possibility, didn't hesitate. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, I'm not losing, and I'm not letting them destroy this program." Officer began compiling documentation with obsessive intensity. He gathered all of therapeutic progress reports, doctors' research, school assessments, medical records showing improved health outcomes. He documented each interaction with Fletcher, every questionable decision, every irregularity in her handling of the case. Legal aid was contacted. An attorney named James, no relation to Doctor, though the coincidence seemed somehow providential, agreed to take the case pro. He was aggressive, experienced in foster care law, and immediately recognized the injustice of Fletcher's actions. "This caseworker is weaponizing protocol against an unconventional but measurably successful program," said after reviewing the documentation. "The court won't like that, but we need to move fast. She's scheduled a formal relocation hearing for exactly 4 weeks from today. That's our deadline. We have 30 days to prepare a case so compelling that a judge will overturn her recommendation." 30 days, 4 weeks. The courtroom battle was coming, and everything: future, guardianship, the therapy dog program, the possibility of healing, hung in the balance. The darkness had arrived. Now came the fight. The Franklin County Courthouse was a formidable structure of gray stone and Gothic architecture that seemed designed to intimidate. Had never been inside a courtroom before, and the sheer weight of the space, the high ceilings, the polished wood, the flags flanking the judge's bench, made her feel small and vulnerable. She sat at the defense table beside her attorney, James, wearing a navy dress she'd purchased specifically for this appearance. Next to her, Officer sat with Doctor, both understanding the gravity of what was about to unfold. Across the courtroom sat Fletcher with the county's attorney, a sharp-featured woman named who'd built a reputation as a fierce litigator for social services. Believed in the sanctity of institutional protocol, and she was prepared to argue that's home, combined with an experimental therapy program, constituted an unsuitable placement for a traumatized child. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with an expression that suggested she'd seen everything the legal system had to offer and was thoroughly unimpressed by most of it. She was 63 years old, had presided over family court for 15 years, and maintained a stern, by-the-book approach to all proceedings. Her reputation was one of skepticism toward emotional arguments and preference for documented fact and established protocol. "This is a custody and placement review hearing," Judge Harrison announced, settling into her chair. "I'll hear arguments from both the county and the respondent regarding the placement of minor Williams. County first." Stood with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. She methodically presented the county's case. Had been placed with his grandmother under temporary guardianship following his mother's incarceration. The placement had subsequently become informal and unconventional. A police officer was conducting unsupervised therapeutic sessions with the child. The program lacked institutional oversight and posed potential liability issues. Most significantly, Ms. Williams, while well-intentioned, was a 68-year-old woman without formal qualifications, managing a complex trauma case without proper professional support structure. "We're not questioning Ms. Williams's love for her grandson," said smoothly. "But love is not sufficient for managing a child with selective mutism and documented trauma disorder. The county recommends placement in the Riverside Institutional Care Facility, where would receive structured, professionally supervised care with appropriate safeguards and protocols." James countered aggressively. "The county's recommendation prioritizes protocol over the child's documented. Ms. Williams has provided stable, loving care for 9 months, has shown measurable therapeutic progress under the current arrangement. Moving him to an institutional facility would constitute a step backward in his recovery. Judge Harrison raised her hand. I'll hear expert testimony before we debate the merits. Doctor took the stand, and under careful questioning from the attorney, she presented her research with academic precision. She discussed selective mutism, the neurochemistry of trauma recovery, and the specific therapeutic mechanism by which animals facilitate healing in traumatized children. She presented data, anxiety scores, speech measurements, school performance metrics, sleep studies. Everything documented, peer-reviewed. In my professional assessment, Doctor concluded, recovery has been remarkable. The human-animal bond with Officer K9 Duke has facilitated measurable neurological and emotional integration that would typically require years of intensive therapy. His current placement with his grandmother, combined with structured therapeutic intervention, represents optimal care for this particular child. Cross-examination was surgical. Doctor, isn't it true that therapy dogs require proper certification? That they're not standard clinical tools but rather alternative or complementary interventions? That's true, but... And isn't it also true that allowing a police K9 to conduct therapeutic sessions represents a significant deviation from established protocols? The protocols were established before this particular application was recognized as therapeutically viable. The science supports. Thank you, Doctor, interrupted. Your Honor, the witness is essentially admitting that this program operates outside established clinical standards. Judge Harrison's expression remained neutral, but Officer noticed her taking notes, not encouraging notes, critical notes. Preschool teacher, Ms. Next. She describes transformation from a withdrawn, non-communicative child to one who participated in group activities, made social connections with other children, and demonstrated remarkable emotional growth. The change in him has been extraordinary, Ms. said earnestly. When he first arrived at our school, he sat by himself, didn't interact. Now he plays with other children, shares toys, participates in activities. Whatever they're doing with that dog, it's working. But under cross-examination, painted a different picture. Ms., you're not a clinician, correct? You're a preschool teacher. That's right. So your observations, while well-intentioned, are essentially subjective impressions rather than clinical assessments. I suppose, but I work with children every day and... Thank you, Your Honor. The county would like to present institutional care outcome statistics. The county presented data showing that Riverside Institutional Care Facility had lower incident rates of behavioral problems, more structured programming, and formal oversight protocols. It was impressive on paper, until James pointed out that Riverside was also perpetually understaffed, had a 9-to-1 child-to-counselor ratio, and operated under chronic budget constraints. By mid-afternoon, it became clear that Judge Harrison wasn't impressed by emotional testimony or anecdotal evidence. She kept returning to the same question. Where are the established protocols? Where is the institutional oversight? During a brief recess, Officer felt panic rising. We're losing. She doesn't care about the therapeutic results. She only cares about protocol. James' face was grim. I know. I need to do something dramatic, something that shifts the emotional and evidentiary paradigm. As the hearing resumed, made an unusual request. Your Honor, I'd like to request permission to bring a material witness into the courtroom. Judge Harrison looked skeptical. We've heard all pertinent witnesses. Your Honor, the most important witness to recovery hasn't been heard. I'm requesting permission to bring Officer's K9 partner, Duke, into the courtroom. I believe the judge will understand why when the dog enters. The courtroom erupted in whispers, stood immediately. Your Honor, this is absurd. A dog as a witness. This is emotional manipulation, nothing more. Your Honor, countered, Duke is not testifying as a traditional witness. Rather, his presence will demonstrate the therapeutic bond that forms the foundation of recovery. I believe the judge will find it probative." Judge Harrison's expression suggested she thought this was the most ridiculous request she'd heard all week. But she'd presided over family court long enough to understand that sometimes the most important evidence wasn't documentary. "Very well," she said with visible reluctance. "But this better be worth my time, counselor, and the dog better be under complete control." Officer left the courtroom and returned 20 minutes later with Duke on a professional leash, the dog immaculate and perfectly behaved. The K9 entered the courtroom with dignified bearing, completely calm despite the unusual environment. Judge Harrison watched with arms crossed, clearly skeptical that a dog could possibly change her legal assessment, appeared ready to object to everything. For several minutes, nothing extraordinary happened. Duke sat beside Officer, occasionally glancing around the courtroom with mild interest. Judge Harrison's skepticism seemed to intensify. This was a waste of time, her expression suggested, emotional theater with no legal substance. And then, who'd been sitting rigidly throughout the entire proceeding, suddenly stood. As she whispered, the 3-year-old, who'd been sitting quietly beside his grandmother, stood up with surprising speed. For a moment, he simply looked at Duke across the courtroom. The distance between them seemed enormous. Then ran. Time seemed to shift into a different dimension, moved with a purposefulness that transcended his 3-year-old frame. He wasn't running carelessly or with childish exuberance. He was moving with the focused determination of someone responding to a call that superseded all other considerations. His small sneakers pounded against the polished courtroom floor, the sound echoing through the high-ceilinged space with startling clarity. Officer's instinct was to maintain control, to manage the dog and the situation, but something in Duke's demeanor suggested that interference would be wrong. The K9 remained perfectly still, his entire body oriented toward the approaching child, his expression transforming into something that transcended the clinical definition of animal behavior. It was recognition. It was love. It was the unmistakable physical manifestation of a bond that existed beyond explanation or protocol. The courtroom fell silent. Every person present seemed to hold their breath simultaneously, as though they understood they were witnessing something significant, something that transcended the normal legal proceedings. Reached Duke and did something that no one, not officer, not doctor, not James, not even had anticipated with such emotional intensity. The child wrapped his small arms around the dog's neck with the desperation of someone clinging to a life raft in turbulent waters. His face pressed against Duke's shoulder, and his entire body seemed to meld into the dog's solid frame, as though seeking to merge with the only thing in his traumatized world that felt absolutely safe. For 3 long seconds, nothing more happened. The child and dog remained locked in an embrace that spoke volumes about the depth of their connection, then pulled back slightly, maintaining his grip on Duke's neck, and looked directly at Officer. When he spoke, his voice was clear, articulate, and filled with an emotion so pure that it seemed to physically alter the atmosphere in the courtroom. "Duke is my best friend," said, his voice steady despite his young age. "Duke helps me feel safe. I don't want to leave him." It was the longest sentence had spoken since his mother's overdose. 9 months of silence, interrupted only by whispered single words and tentative 2-word phrases, suddenly crystallized into a complete, coherent statement. But it wasn't the length of the sentence that mattered. It was the clarity of purpose, the emotional articulation, the demonstration of linguistic and emotional capability that everyone present understood had been impossible 3 months ago. The county attorney sat frozen, her carefully constructed legal arguments suddenly rendered meaningless in the face of what everyone had just witnessed. Whatever clinical objections she might have raised, whatever protocol violations she might have cited, paled in comparison to the undeniable evidence of a child's recovered voice. Judge Harrison removed her glasses. This was the first time anyone in the courtroom had seen her without them, and the gesture seemed to symbolize a removal of professional armor, a step into personal humanity. Her stern expression, the expression that had remained immobile throughout hours of testimony, visibly crumbled. Her eyes, which had been cold and evaluative, filled with tears that she made no attempt to conceal or wipe away. Made a sound, a combination of a gasp and a sob, and her hand covered her mouth. Beside her, she felt the arm of a bailiff who'd stepped forward instinctively to steady her, understanding that she might physically collapse from the emotional intensity of the moment. Doctor, who'd maintained clinical composure throughout the entire proceedings, found her professional mask slipping. She reached over and gripped Officer's arm, her fingers digging in with an intensity that communicated the magnitude of what they'd just accomplished. Himself had tears streaming down his face, his eyes never leaving, understanding that this moment represented the culmination of everything he'd worked toward. James, the attorney, stood silently, understanding that his legal arguments were no longer necessary. The courtroom had transcended the realm of legal discourse into something more fundamental, a demonstration of truth that required no interpretation or argument. Judge Harrison put her glasses back on, a gesture of returning to her judicial role, but her demeanor had fundamentally changed. She looked with an expression of profound compassion, then at Duke with what could only be described as wonder. She then turned her gaze to, and everyone in the courtroom could see the moment understanding transformed into conviction. "Officer," the judge said, her voice thick with emotion, "please bring the child and the dog to the bench." Officer, with hand now holding his, and with Duke walking calmly beside them, approached the elevated judge's bench. The judge leaned forward, getting closer to than would typically be appropriate in formal court proceedings, but protocol seemed suddenly irrelevant. Judge Harrison said gently, "My name is Judge Harrison. I'm very glad to meet you." Looked up at the judge with the same calm directness he'd shown when speaking about Duke. The judge smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed her stern features into something almost maternal. "Can you tell me what Duke means to you?" the judge asked. Considered the question with surprising thoughtfulness for a 3-year-old. "Duke helps my heart. When I'm scared, Duke makes it not scary. Duke loves me." Judge Harrison's eyes closed for a moment, and a tear rolled down her cheek. When she opened them again, she looked at Officer with an expression that communicated volumes. "Officer, how long have you been working with this child?" "9 months, Your Honor. Twice weekly, supervised by doctor with careful documentation of all progress." And this progress, the speech, the emotional development, this is directly attributable to the therapy dog program. "Yes, Your Honor, all documented by doctor's clinical assessments." Judge Harrison then turned to, "Ms., does the county have anything further to present?" Stood awkwardly, understanding that her entire case had just been dismantled by a single moment of unfiltered truth. "Your Honor, the county maintains that institutional protocols." "Sit down, Ms., Judge Harrison interrupted, her voice not unkind but firm. "Protocols exist to serve children. They don't exist so that children can be sacrificed to their preservation." She turned back to, "Would you like to stay with your grandmother?" Nodded solemnly, "Yes, and Duke, I want Duke." The judge smiled again, "I think that can be arranged." As Officer guided and Duke back to the defense table, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had dominated the proceedings lifted, replaced by a sense of something larger than legal victory, a sense that justice, genuine justice, had been served. Judge Harrison sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful and slightly amazed, as though she just witnessed something that had fundamentally altered her understanding of what courts could accomplish. She looked at the stacks of legal documents before her, all the protocols, precedents, and arguments, and seemed to recognize their inadequacy in the face of simple human truth. She picked up her gavel. "This hearing will conclude with my judgment," she said, her voice now carrying authority infused with compassion. "My decision will be comprehensive and will address not only this particular case, but the future of this therapeutic program in this county." She looked directly at Ms. Williams. "I have significant respect for what you've done for your grandson. The love you've shown transcends legal definition." She looked at officer and doctor. "Your work here represents exactly what justice should be, using available resources to help children heal. That's not deviation from protocol. That's the highest expression of professional purpose." Finally, she looked at who sat with his arm around Duke's neck, completely calm and present. "And thank you for reminding all of us what actually matters." She raised her gavel and the room fell silent, awaiting the judgment that would determine the course of multiple lives. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom. "My judgment is as follows," she announced, her voice steady and deliberate. "Regarding the placement of Williams, the child shall remain in the legal guardianship of Williams. Furthermore, the therapy dog program under the direction of Officer Thomas and Doctor is hereby approved as an official adjunct to this child's care plan. This decision is based on documented evidence of therapeutic efficacy and measurable improvement in the minor's psychological, emotional, and developmental status." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Moreover, I'm recommending that the City Council reconsider its decision to defund this program. The evidence presented in this courtroom demonstrates that this program represents a legitimate and highly effective therapeutic intervention. I will be personally submitting a written recommendation to the City Council requesting continued funding and expansion of this initiative to other children in the foster care system." The courtroom erupted, held tightly, her entire body shaking with relief and joy. Officer and doctor embraced, both unable to contain their tears. Even the bailiff, typically emotionally neutral in the formal courtroom environment, smiled broadly. Began gathering her documents with visible reluctance, her carefully constructed case dismantled by a single moment of human truth. She acknowledged defeat with professional grace, offering no objections or appeals. Outside the courthouse, standing on the granite steps in afternoon sunlight, the celebration was immediate and genuine. Held while officer and doctor stood beside them, both radiating a sense of vindication and triumph. "We did it," Doctor said simply, her voice still thick with emotion. "Against all odds, we did it." "This is just the beginning," Officer replied, his eyes reflecting the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. "The judge is recommending expansion. She's going to fight City Council herself. This program is going to grow." Within 2 weeks, the City Council voted unanimously to reinstate and expand the therapy dog program. Not only was it funded, but they approved the addition of 3 more K-9 officers to the initiative. Officer was promoted to program director, a position that allowed him to maintain his police duties while overseeing the therapeutic applications of the department's K-9 units. Doctor, with collaboration, wrote a comprehensive peer-reviewed study documenting the program's results. The research was published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Clinical Practice, attracting national attention. Universities across the country began requesting consultation regarding similar programs. Within 6 months, therapy dog initiatives had been established in 12 states. But the most profound changes were personal rather than institutional. Continued his remarkable trajectory. By his 4th birthday, he was speaking fluently, participating actively in preschool, and demonstrating emotional resilience that seemed almost miraculous given his traumatic beginning. The anxiety that had once paralyzed him had transformed into normal childhood caution. The silence that had defined his early trauma had been replaced by a child's natural curiosity and growing joy. His relationship with Duke became the subject of gentle jokes within the program. When separated for more than a few days, Both child and dog exhibited noticeable distress. The therapeutic bond had become so complete that they seemed almost inseparable. But the most transformative moment came 8 months after the courtroom victory. Jennifer Williams' mother completed her rehabilitation program successfully. She'd maintained sobriety for 14 months, a milestone that seemed impossible when she was first admitted. Through therapy, medical intervention, and the relentless support of addiction counselors, she'd reconstructed her life from the wreckage of her addiction. The reunification hearing was scheduled for a morning in October, exactly 1 year after had spoken his first words to Duke. Brought to the courthouse, but this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. This wasn't a battle or a defense. This was the possibility of a family being restored. Jennifer sat in the courtroom waiting room, her hands trembling with anticipation and fear. She'd maintained supervised visits with over the past 6 months, and each visit had been a small miracle of connection and forgiveness. But reunification, actually bringing her son home, actually being his primary caregiver again, that was something almost too monumental to contemplate. The judge entered and the proceedings moved swiftly. Jennifer's rehabilitation was documented. Her psychological evaluations were positive. Her employment was stable. Her housing was appropriate. All the boxes were checked. But the most important evidence was entered the courtroom looking for his mother with the unself-consciousness of a child who'd learned to trust again. When he saw Jennifer, his face illuminated with recognition and genuine affection. He ran to her, and Jennifer collapsed to her knees, holding her son with the gratitude of someone who'd been given back what addiction had nearly stolen forever. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The judge approved the reunification, with maintaining legal guardianship and frequent visitation rights. It was a compromise that honored all relationships, his mother, his grandmother, and the dog who'd made all healing possible. But reunification wasn't the end of Duke's story. It was just a new chapter. Duke continued his therapy work with 6 additional children in the program. Officer trained 5 new K-9 handlers in the therapeutic protocols. The program expanded to include not just selective mutism, but also anxiety disorders, behavioral issues, and attachment disorders in children throughout the foster care system. 2 years after the courtroom victory, the Memorial Therapy Dog Program, named in honor of both the child whose healing inspired it and the officer who envisioned it, was operating in 47 cities across 19 states. Over 300 children annually received therapeutic support through trained K-9 partnerships. Universities were offering courses on human-animal interaction therapy. Legislation had been passed in 7 states, formalizing the legal and therapeutic standing of animal-assisted intervention programs. Doctor published 3 additional research papers documenting the program's expansion and long-term outcomes. Officer received the Police Officer of the Year award from the National Law Enforcement Leadership Council, though he insisted the honor belonged to everyone involved. Love, Doctor's expertise, Judge Harrison's wisdom, and Duke's inexplicable ability to heal. Now 5 years old and living with his mother while maintaining his bond with Duke, became an unofficial ambassador for the program. He appeared in educational videos, spoke, with Doctor's guidance, at university lectures, and symbolized the power of what was possible when love, science, and institutional will converged. On the 2nd anniversary of that fateful day, when Duke had escaped his police vehicle and changed everything, Officer brought Duke to his kindergarten class. The reunion between child and dog was as emotionally charged as their first connection had been. Wrapped his arms around Duke's neck and whispered something that only the dog could hear. Later, when Officer asked what he'd said, smiled with the wisdom of a child who'd endured tremendous pain and emerged intact on the other side. "I told Duke thank you," said simply, "because he found me when I was lost." That night, in a quiet moment at home, Officer reflected on the extraordinary trajectory of his life. What had begun as a chance accident, a police dog escaping from a vehicle, had become a movement that was changing how society approached childhood trauma. It had transformed his career, revitalized his sense of purpose, and created a legacy that would outlast him. He looked at Duke, now graying slightly around the muzzle but still radiating the same gentle intensity that had captured his broken heart. "You're a good dog, buddy," said, running his hand across Duke's head. "You're one of the best things that ever happened to me." Duke rested his head on his lap, content in the knowledge that he'd done something extraordinary, that he'd changed lives simply by being himself. Loyal, intuitive, and possessed of a love that transcended all boundaries between human and animal. The story of a 3-year-old boy and a police dog had become something much larger, a testament to the transformative power of unexpected connections, the importance of fighting for what's right, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from institutions or protocols, but from love expressed in its form. In the years that followed, Story would inspire similar programs worldwide. His voice, literally recovered, metaphorically celebrated, would echo through courtrooms, universities, and homes, reminding everyone that sometimes the impossible just needs one person brave enough to imagine it and one dog brave enough to make it real.